The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Hello, and welcome back to Liberty Mail, a podcast by the Institute for Faith and Freedom. We're back with another episode today, interviewing one of our writers for Checkpoint News, and today's conversation will be with Elijah Gritsavage. Elijah is a history major here at Grove City College with minors in political science, classical Christian education, and philosophy, triple minor. That's incredible. He interned last summer with Moms for Liberty and is currently a marketing fellow here at the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and joins us today to discuss his newest article in Checkpoint News, Capital Punishment in Historic Protestantism. Elijah, welcome to Liberty Mail.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad that you are here, and especially for the article that you're here to talk about, because I'm someone who admittedly was quite neutral on the death penalty for most of my life, but I did actually find your article quite convicting on that topic, so I'm glad that you're here. I just wanted to open up with why capital punishment? Why was that an area of focus? Why did you choose to write about that at Checkpoint News over the bazillion other topics that you could have written about?
Right, yeah. I think one reason I chose to write about it is I just view it as a sort of blind spot today in our culture, broadly speaking, but especially among Christians, as sort of this thing that maybe is untouchable to an extent, or you just kind of you view that as being outside the realm of, what Christians need to be thinking about. They're more centered on the gospel, this kind of thing. And, they sort of leave the state to the state. But I think that there's obviously precedent in the Christian tradition, Protestant more specifically, as, I wrote on. And also, I think there's problem with crime, and I think everyone will recognize that. And I'm of the opinion that one of the ways to fix that is to use capital punishment as a viable option. And I don't think that that's contradictory to the Christian tradition. So that was why I chose to write on it.
Yeah, if I could ask you about something specific, you mentioned in your article the assassination of Charlie Kirk and other symbols of rising violent crime in our country. So would you think then that violence levels would drop if the capital punishment became more universal?
I think so, yeah. I think by nature of the fact that, well, one, you're removing arbiters of violent crime to an extent. Yeah. And two, I think that it would act much more as a deterrent, depending on, how harshly and how far you really want to go. There are obviously, there's a plane there. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But, I mean, take, for example, like El Salvador with Nayib Bukele. Employing capital punishment, sure, he had other methods as well, but he definitely cracked down harder on crime, harder on gangs. And it's now much for the better there. So reducing crime unlocks human flourishing in ways I think we can all rejoice in. So I'm not surprised that as a history major you chose to defend the capital punishment concept using historical sources. I just wanted to ask you if you could walk our audience through the key arguments by the leaders of the Protestant faith. You talk about Luther and Calvin and the like, about why they thought capital punishment was the right way to go. Sure. Well, part of it, I think, and this gets into why I'm of the opinion that a lot of contemporary Christians misunderstand this issue, is what the debate is actually on. Okay. It's less so the viability of capital punishment as a means of correction or any kind of punishment for criminals in the state, and more to do with the nature of the civil magistrate and what all falls under his umbrella. Yeah. I believe that the civil magistrate and the government by extension is instituted by God. I think you can find evidence for that in Scripture in passages like Romans 13, which guys like Calvin, Luther, Cranmer, Knox, who I all mention in my article, would draw from there, certainly. And one of the things is, and this ties into the nature of God as well, is that God is just. And so by instituting government and by giving the sword to the civil magistrate, one of the things that they are supposed to do is exact justice and punish the evildoer, and I guess by extension then promote virtue to some extent as well. And so, certainly all four of the authors that I bring up in my article would agree with that as is evidence in their personal writings. And so capital punishment is one of the ways in which the civil magistrate then exacts justice by punishing evil, and this would be to the fullest extent, obviously taking somebody's life. but I would say that it has more to do with the nature of the civil magistrate.
Yeah.
And less, so it's less of an argument, I guess, for solely the death penalty,
Sure.
and more the death penalty as a tool that is well within the playing field for him to use.
That it's a power that has been given, trusted to the civil magistrate by
Right.
God, and
Correct.
that maybe we don't have the ability to take that away.
Mm-hmm.
I would wonder, though, I would think of some critics that would say, "Oh, but we're so much more enlightened now. You know, all these old people that lived hundreds of years ago, like we know better. We're more compassionate."
Sure.
So, what's your response to that? Why is it so significant that we're drawing from these historical upstream of our faith? Yeah.
Well, one, maybe just as a little thread to pull on, is it a good thing that we're more compassionate? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's something to talk about.
We might get to that.
But two, at least if we're speaking to a Christian audience, a self-identifying, Protestant audience, Reformed people, Lutherans, Anglicans, we draw much from these guys for our faith practices,
Absolutely.
how we set up our worship, our liturgies, what we believe about the nature of God, our soteriology, all this kind of thing. And so if we're fine to accept their teachings on things of that nature, then it wouldn't really make sense to not accept their teachings when it comes to more the relationship between the state and God, or the state and the church, this sort of thing. And I think that this is part of a larger problem today, and we may touch on this later as well, of Christians, especially Protestant Christians, sort of cherry picking what they like from their, who they would claim are their, spiritual forefathers, the founders of their faith, and, turning a blind eye to the stuff they don't like. And I think this is a topic that for sure falls under that category.
Well, it's certainly uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I see that. You took some jabs, actually, speaking of maybe a more squishy Protestantism that you strike at. You reference an article from the nonprofit Christian Social Action that advocates against the death penalty. You walk us through what you think they got wrong and what you think Protestants in general get wrong about the death penalty.
Well, that article in particular, I think it had a slew of theological problems, personally. But I think one of them is misunderstanding the nature of God. Like they sort of, it seemed, reading through it, and obviously I haven't spoken to the author personally, but it seemed to be reducing God to just a benevolent creator that loves, but it stop there, ends there, and not recognizing that part of being a benevolent, loving creator that God is that he must be just as well. And it seemed in much of their arguing against the death penalty that they were leaving out the requirement of justice to punish evil, and that has to be the case because evil cannot coexist with good there. So I think that was one of the problems. And the other was, this would maybe just be how they interpret the text, the scriptures, taking a less, perhaps, literal approach to reading Paul's writing, or, saying that Paul was writing for a particular audience context and feeling that he was a little more ambiguous than maybe somebody like I am reading him as. But I think those were some of the problems there, yeah.
Great. Now, you talk about kind of a general cultural malaise in our society of being overly empathetic. What does that mean? What does it look like to be overly empathetic?
Yeah, as it relates to this, I think when I was writing, one of the things I think of is we don't like confrontation, conflict, punishment, this sort of thing. And so as it relates to criminals, it's not fun to say, this person might need to die. Like they might need to be punished in this way. But then we're not being then empathetic in the ways that we need to be to others. Like if we're not punishing criminals and if we're not, exacting justice, then we're creating injustice, and we're creating other victims. So we might be being empathetic, quote unquote, to the person that we're sparing their life, and we'll give them life in prison or 10 years and then they get out, something of this kind. But what about then all the people who are harmed, perhaps even killed by criminals that maybe would have been deterred otherwise, or it would have been stopped? So I think it's just a change in perspective of where is the love, where is the empathy being directed. I think I'm directing it more at the people that obviously everyone deserves it to an extent, but never at the expense of the victims.
Right. Well, the duty of the civil magistrate, right, is to protect people,
right,
and is to provide for the flourishing of probably most especially the weak, and those would be the people that be the victims of these crimes. Now, we're going to close with this. You argue Protestantism, in its modern iterations, have diverged from historic convictions regarding the death penalty, among other issues. How do we reclaim this? How do we reclaim our convictions on this topic and others?
I think a large part of this is just a return to the sources. Read what these guys wrote. Read the creeds. Read the confessions. Read their writings. It's fine to read contemporary theologians and get their take on it. But if you're only reading contemporary understandings and you're never reading the source material, then you don't know in what way the contemporary guys are diverging from, the original. And so especially as, if you're self-identifying as a Lutheran, like it would make sense to read Luther, right? Sure. Like you're not going to not read him. And read him in his fullness, read all of his works, even the ones that you may disagree on. And if you do disagree, that's fine, but you need to understand that you are not in step with him there and reconcile that with yourself in some way. So I think one way that it would play out is to read them and recognize and just be truthful with yourself about where you're diverging, why you're diverging. There may not even be a problem there, but that would be a good step. And then I guess the other part of this then is being truthful with yourself about how much are you really in like maybe you find you're not actually that much in that tradition like you thought you were, but it was sort of a later maybe version or kind of byproduct of something, a branch off of. So that would be the thing I would say, return to the sources.
That's wonderful. Well, Elijah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you out there for listening to our episode. Please feel free to come back anytime to listen to some more Liberty Mail.
For more information on faith and freedom, visit faithandfreedom.com.